My name is Catherine Williams, and I'm Research Director at the Centre for Public Integrity. If this is the first time that you're coming across our work, we're an independent think tank dedicated to preventing corruption, protecting the integrity of our accountability institutions, and eliminating the undue influence of money in politics in Australia. Thank you for being with us today from wherever across the country you might be joining. I'm joining you from the country of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people joining us here today. I imagine that if you're logging on to participate in this webinar, like us, you see an increasing culture of government secrecy as cause for concern. We see refusal of FOI applications on questionable grounds. Just this Monday, it was reported that there was a bulk refusal of applications in the wake of Christian Porter's resignation from the ministry. We have secret prosecutions, as we've seen in the deeply troubling cases of Witness K and Bernard Collaery. We have the use of provisions that enable the Attorney General to make a certification that information within a report by the Auditor General be suppressed from the Parliament, even though the executive is supposed to be accountable to the Parliament. And there's no oversight mechanism for the use of a certification like this. Then, true to form, we have a Commonwealth Integrity Commission model that prevents both public hearings and public reporting in the case of public sector corruption. There is, it would seem, reason not only for concern, but indeed for alarm. We're very fortunate today to be hearing from two people who are well versed with efforts by government to resist access to information. Geoffrey Watson SC is a board member of our centre. He is also a former counsel assisting New South Wales ICAC, and very recently he was Senator Rex Patrick's representative in his successful challenge to the government's refusal to reveal national cabinet documents. Paul Farrell is a reporter for ABC 730, as well as a lawyer. He was previously named the Walkley Young Australian Journalist of the Year, and he's worked on major international investigations, including the Panama Papers and the HSBC Swiss tax files. He's also broken major Australian stories, including the sale of Medicare cards on the dark web and the Commonwealth Bank's loss of almost 20 million account records. Almost 7 years ago, Paul wrote that FOI is a small but powerful tool that ordinary citizens can use to counter government power. When used effectively, it can prise open the inner works of government to devastating effect. Having watched how Paul himself uses documents he accesses via FOI to devastating effect, I am, as no doubt you are, very interested to hear what he has to say about barriers to accessing government information and how these impact on the work of the media. Paul, thank you.
Thanks so much, Catherine, and thank you so much for that very generous introduction. And hello to everyone here. I'm amazed that there are so many people who are interested in this topic. So really glad to be here, and thanks also to Geoffrey as well for taking his time. I guess I thought I'd just initially maybe talk briefly about what FOI and what accessing government information looks like for journalists. And that piece that I have to say I don't even remember writing, that Catherine quoted from 7 years ago, I would say that line still holds very much true. A tool like FOI is a real sword that journalists can use in their armory of information to prise open what is happening in government. And over the years, I've been sort of fortunate enough to use that in quite effective ways in a whole range of stories. One of my favourite sort of applications of FOI was a couple of years ago when I was at The Guardian. We revealed that the Immigration Department had lost the passport details and personal information of the G20 world leaders, because someone had accidentally sent them to the organising committee of the Asian World Cup football club, which was a pretty embarrassing moment and highlighted some pretty staggering failures within the department about how they handled personal information. And that all came from FOI. And, you know, more recently, earlier this year, we've done a whole series of stories on government grants. We've looked at Peter Dutton's Safer Communities program, the Building Better Regions Fund, and we've been able to get access to a whole range of documents through FOI that have really shown what government ministers have been doing sort of in relation to how they make decisions about grants. So it's an incredibly powerful and important tool, and Australia is one of the early adopters of FOI. We're one of the first countries to introduce an FOI Act. It's a really important part of our culture, but it can and does fall down, and it is a system that has become clunky. It's the Act itself is in desperate need of an overhaul, and it can and is stymied very effectively by a whole range of participants in the process, and that's particularly the case when journalists are doing FOIs. And I mean, some people here who are journalists might already, I'm sure, be well aware of this, but for those of you who aren't, I mean, whenever I would do an FOI request, it would pretty routinely be that as soon as I lodge that request, someone in the media department gets sent that request, and then a little brief is written as a sort of hot issue alert. Paul Farrell has just requested this information under FOI, and that's sort of circulated to a whole bunch of people within any government organisation. I've seen plenty of those documents circulated. It happens regularly, and the intention, of course, is to alert people that we're looking at a particular topic or looking at a particular issue in a certain way. And I would say that certainly in some cases that we've looked at in quite a bit of detail, we've been able to establish, you know, that sort of high alert that it puts bureaucrats on sometimes does make it much harder to get access to government information. And to give you some examples of where this comes into play, it can and does come into play often in areas where there is a sort of sensitive government policy, or there's a lot of scrutiny over a particular issue. And one sort of recent example that we had was we were trying to access the contract with AstraZeneca for all our vaccines, which, you know, I would argue is a pretty major issue of public interest. You know, it's one of the most significant contracts that our government will probably enter into for years, if not decades, relating to the pandemic. And the health department refused access to that contract in full on the grounds that it would interfere with national security. And I find it quite extraordinary that we're in a position now, you know, 18 months into the pandemic, and not only do we not have any visibility of these contractual arrangements, which are really important government spending initiatives, but we also don't even actually know the dollar amount that the Australian government has paid to AstraZeneca, to Pfizer, for these enormously important contracts. And that's a pretty extraordinary situation to be in when many other countries have disclosed that sort of information. So I would say, you know, the Act works. It can work really effectively, but equally there are a whole range of exemptions and ways that access can be stymied. And you know, I would say, you know, I mean, this year I've probably lodged over 100 FOIs, and in maybe a handful of those occasions have we gotten documents of real substance through. So you know, it's not like a one-for-one game. You really have to persist with it, and it's becoming increasingly complex legally as well, and I'm fortunate to be a solicitor as well, so I can kind of call bullshit on government solicitors who seek to sort of put forward at times quite bizarre interpretations of the FOI Act and how it should operate. And it means that the barrier for access is very, very high. And in addition to that, we also have a regulator, the Information Commissioner, that was very substantially weakened some years ago when it was defunded. It's now been refunded, but certainly from my experience, matters just sit there for years and years. I have matters going back 3 or 4 years. They sit there. There are enormous delays. There's no real explanation of why those delays are so severe. And I think the culture of that agency has really struggled to be a real champion of access to government information, which was what it was set out to be. And I saw some reporting earlier this week that Rex Patrick has actually mounted a federal court case seeking judicial review specifically because of the delays in the Information Commissioner's office in administering the Act. There's all kinds of bizarre interpretations of the Act as well, like this very peculiar one where apparently when a minister leaves office, the documents that are held by that office are no longer accessible under FOI. So I think that there's a huge amount of work to be done. But I think there's a strong case for a major overhaul of the FOI Act, and indeed that was recommended in a government charges review back in 2012 or 2013. It's never been acted upon. And I think there's some really important cultural work to be done as well. I also don't think that this is necessarily a partisan issue, because I've been doing FOIs, for the last sort of 15 years, and I certainly observed many of the same challenges and barriers around access to government information, during coalition and Labor governments as well. And it really comes down to having a really robust Act, a really robust regulator, and a culture of real pro-disclosure. And that's kind of what I wanted to say from the outset.
Need to unmute myself. That's been really interesting to hear about, Paul. I mean, I must say, I was fascinated to hear about what you said of there being an alert system across government when someone perhaps likes you makes an FOI request, and it alerts the government to an area that you might be interested in. The fact of this alert system that you refer to really does seem to suggest a concerted effort to avoid scrutiny on a particular point. So that was fascinating. Thank you. Now we are next going to hear from Geoffrey Watson SC. So as I've previously explained, Geoffrey is a member of the board of the Centre for Public Integrity. He's also a former counsel assisting ICAC, and he's acted as an advisor to federal, state and territory governments on issues of integrity and corruption. He's an indefatigable advocate for transparency and accountability. So we're very, very fortunate to have him here with us today. Thank you, Geoffrey.
Thank you, Catherine. I've never been called indefatigable before. Everybody, I've written a little paper on this, and the Centre will publish it on their website, I imagine, maybe later today. I've called it Buried at Sea. It's a reason for that, and I'm going to come back to it. Paul's right. In the 1970s, Australia was ahead of the world. We had cutting-edge approach to it. I don't know how many people know this. In 1972, Labor went to the election with a promise that they would introduce FOI legislation. They won, but couldn't get it through the Senate. But it was not a party political issue. In 1978, Senator Durack introduced it into the federal parliament again. And he said the reasons we need this and what it does, they're simple. Well, maybe not so simple, because 4 years later, it passed into law. It took 4 years to get through the system. And when you have a look at what they did in 1982, it's just incredibly admirable. It was well ahead of its time. Bear this in mind. Other Westminster systems did not have this kind of legislation. UK's only got it relatively recently. Blair brought it in. Now, our 1982 Act had explicit objects. It said that the Australian community has a right to access this information, that the purpose behind the legislation was to enhance representative democracy, encourage public participation, and to promote better informed decision-making. It was hoped, these are in the objects of the Act, they're still there today, that it would increase scrutiny, discussion, comment, and review of government actions. And it said that the paperwork needs to be kept because that is a national resource. Oh, dear me, noble sentiments. Where did it go so wrong? You know, back in the day, the coalition, the Liberal Party, was so emphatically in favour of freedom to information of this kind that one of the leading cases, 1985 it was, wanted the documents relied upon Treasury in drawing up the budget. They wanted to see it so that they could expose government thinking and open it up to all of us. The person who commenced that suit was the then Deputy Leader of the Opposition, John Howard. Anyway, since 1978 and until now, openness and transparency in decision-making has always been understood to be a foundation, a cornerstone, if you like, of good government. And I mean, I don't need to rave on about this. The reasons for that are obvious. In an open, liberal democracy, the more people know, the better when they're coming to select governments and when they're coming to select the parliamentarians. And part of that is why decisions have been made. Nobody could honestly argue to the contrary. And that's part of the problem. Those who seek to defeat our access to information never do so by addressing the arguments honestly. They do so by other means. They work inside the system. By the way, I'm repeatedly asked by people who are disappointed by the system, what can be done to improve the legislative framework? And they're always surprised by my answer because I say, oh, nothing. The legislative framework is fine. It was properly designed in 1982, and if it was properly applied, it would work well today. Our problem's not with the legislative framework. Our problem is with the people who on a day-to-day basis are seeking to avoid and evade compliance with that framework. The problem lies with our politicians and to some extent by politically motivated bureaucrats. The ethos of the freedom of information legislation has been destroyed. The rules are consistently, routinely broken and ignored. Paul went through some of this. I'm sorry if it's repetitive, but now you lodge an application and what you meet is obstruction. Did you know that the Information Commissioner had been created, brought in to speed up the process and to make it cheaper? It's had exactly the opposite because now the government does this. They respond by giving you reams of redacted pages. The applicant goes to the Information Commissioner and as Paul said, it can sit there for 2 years. And once you get it out of there, if the government gets an adverse result, they've got an automatic right of appeal to the AAT and they do it. Now, at this stage, you can be involved in pretty difficult legal arguments and there's expense, but the delay is the killer. A journalist like Paul is trying to get this information out in respect of an issue which is presently demanding. Let an issue run past for 2 years, 3 years, it's no longer of interest. Yesterday, I can't talk about a current case in which I'm involved, that'd be inappropriate, but I can tell you what the lawyer said to me because I thought it was right. I told him about today's webinar and he said, strangely enough, the Freedom of Information Act is now being used as a tool to withhold access to information. I hadn't thought of that before, but he's quite right. So just bear this in mind. You'll see this all the time in the criminal courts. False legal arguments, expense and delay. Delay is a big thing. They're all implements in the toolkit of whom? Of the unmeritorious litigant. Now, I want to talk to you about something dear to my heart. I want to identify who killed transparency, and I'm going to give you the date they killed it. We know the date, and that's why I call this paper Buried at Sea. We know that things changed on Friday, 8 November 2013. It happened at a media briefing which had been called by the then Immigration Minister, Scott Morrison. The purpose of the briefing was to address issues from the policy known as Operation Sovereign Borders. 63 human beings have been rescued from a sinking boat. Nobody knew what happened to them. We didn't even know if they were still alive, if they had been rescued. People wanted to know. Under pressure, a briefing was arranged with the press. A member of the press on that day asked a simple question: what's become of that boat of asylum seekers? The response to that question was this: the press was told no comment whatsoever would be made because it was a secret. And why was it a secret? The press was told, and by extension, this is telling all of us, it's secret because it involved, quote, on-water matters. I remember that. It ran through my mind, since when has that been an excuse for secrecy? When was that invented? It's not national security. It's not an excuse for anything. And yet you'll recall that from that day, that was a standard Stonewall response. Week in, week out, month in, month out, it went for over a year. Once the government did that and got away with it, they found it addictive. They got a taste for it. It's got an alluring quality, you know, secrecy. So there we are. 8th of November 2013, the day that transparency died. It was murdered live on television by the Abbott government. And as my paper's title suggests, it died on water. Its remains are buried at sea. I'm just going to tell you something about Paul Farrell in this context. If you do any research in this area, you'll turn up that he was one of the original people who got into the government about this, and he used the Freedom of Information legislation to do it. There's a great story written by Paul back in 2017. Apparently, he owned a shaver at that part of his life, and he tells the story about how he got stonewalled and destroyed by a series of, quite frankly, specious arguments defying transparency. Anyway, it's all been downhill since 2013. I don't want to limit what I've got to say to the Foi Act. That's one very obvious area where it's applied, but it's gone far more generally than that. I like this one, the Auditor General. You've got to remember that the Office of the Auditor General has now become probably the single most important federal accountability agency. Yeah, sure, we should have a federal ICAC. We don't. That's another matter. But what we do have is the Auditor General, who's done a sterling job. We know about Leppington Triangle, sports frauds, car park frauds because of the Auditor General. As Paul mentioned, I'm sorry, I think it was Catherine, but as was mentioned, the government's response to that has been negative. At first, they proposed cutting back the Auditor General's budget. In the end, they resolved to increase it, but in accordance with inflation. That, in effect, really means that the funding was cut. I gave evidence at the Senate inquiry about that, and I listened to the evidence from the Auditor General's office on the issue about how they need to dedicate their resources by selective processes because they do not have enough money. There's other things. They're allied to this. Remember I told you that in the objects of the Freedom of Information Act itself, it said we've got to keep the documents because they're a, quote, national resource, unquote. By underfunding the bodies which look after that national resource, I've got in my paper sort of bad joke. Maybe the government's proposing they'll give us access to those records so that we can use them as compost on our gardens. The documents are literally rotting away. And I know this actually at a personal level. I've had a son who's a PhD candidate at the ANU, a scholar seeking access to those documents now has to wait 18 months or longer to get access to them. Try and tell that to a master's student. Doctorate students are trying to get their work done in a year, in 3 years. It's just not fair. Now, it seems to me that the only people who are pursuing the Freedom of Information Act applications could be labelled as the determined and the foolhardy. I include you in that, Paul. But I'm going to talk now about Senator Rex Patrick. I don't know whether we've got any South Australians listening, but I do know this much. There's a lot of people listening to this. Anybody, any of you who know a South Australian, get them to vote for Senator Patrick at the next election. He's been doing a great job. He's a thorn in the flesh of the government, and he's been doing it by way of the Freedom of Information Act. I got in touch with him, or he got in touch with me. We found each other somehow, not Tinder. We got in touch somehow, and so I looked at a few matters for him. And I remember the first time I rang the Australian government solicitor and said, look, I'm ringing on behalf of Senator Patrick about his FOI application. And they said, you're going to have to be a lot more specific than that. He's been a thorn in their flesh. I rang him up and said I was going to deliver this webinar. I said, what do you think about transparency in the federal government? Do you think it's any coincidence that we shortly thereafter had an earthquake in Victoria? His was not a generally positive review. And he gave me around about 15 examples. I've just plucked 2 out. I liked them. There are so many more I could have used. The first one is the Hawkeye Debacle. In 2018, in response to an Auditor General report, Christian Porter did something quite remarkable. As the Attorney General, he unleashed his power to suppress an Auditor General's report. It related to the purchase by the federal government of a new combat vehicle fleet called the Hawkeye. They were manufactured by the multinational arms giant Thales. What had happened was the Auditor General had investigated, made some thoroughly adverse findings. The government didn't want that to come to light, and so they suppressed it. What's more, Thales joined in. Senator Patrick wasn't taking no for an answer. He pursued it, the base level, the Information Commissioner, and then through to the AAT. Well, it turns out that the Attorney General was legally speaking wrong, and Senator Patrick, a former submariner, by the way, was legally right. But by the time those documents emerged, the issue was years old. Another case study from Senator Patrick is one to which Catherine referred. When is a cabinet not a cabinet? As you know the story, the federal government was able to put a stamp of secrecy over all the deliberations of the federal national cabinet, as it was described. It's not a cabinet at all. As you would know, Justice White in the AAT ruled that those arguments were all legally unsound and rejected it. Again, Attorney General Porter, wrong. Senator Patrick, right. It all turned out to be just an attempt to create a shroud of secrecy over something which shouldn't be secret at all. I might say on Monday, I'm going to give some evidence of the Senate investigation into legislation which proposes, in effect, to overturn the effect of that judgment. I'll do what I can on behalf of all Australians who want to know about this. I'll just mention, just in passing, one of my favourites that Senator Patrick told me about is his long and still ongoing fight to get access to information about our arrangements with French authorities in creating submarines. That one's been resisted fiercely. And what's more, you might find it curious now, things weren't always anti-French. The federal government got its own team of lawyers, but also paid for a team of lawyers to represent the French government in resisting Senator Patrick's applications. Now, I want to finish what I've got to say with a really, really sour note upon which to end. Gee, I'd hate you to leave this webinar in a positive frame of mind. I just want to remind you about this. While we are here, think about what's going on to Bernard Collaery. The cases involving witness K and witness J have come and gone, but think about what that involved. I was a child during the Cold War. I was taught by the nuns about the evils of totalitarian regimes. They hated those atheistic, communistic Ruskies. But I heard the stories, and I can tell you I was deeply fascinated, as schoolboys are, just at the cruelty of those people and the idea that they could think it appropriate to conduct secret trials, pitting the resources of the state against an individual, deliberately concealing from the individual being charged the evidence, the allegations, and keeping secret from the public the deliberations and even the result. Civilised countries don't do that. Well, that's going on in Canberra as we speak. I'm not blaming the lawyers or the judges involved. They're quite literally required to follow the letter of the law. I don't even blame the law generally, because the common law would have protected against this and prevented it from occurring. I blame the legislators who overrode the common law protections that we all inherited and have allowed this to occur. And I really blame those centrally involved in this prosecution. The indictment was presented at the direction of the former Attorney General Christian Porter, a man whose judgment has been questioned from time to time. Quite frankly, they should all be ashamed. You know, sometimes good things come from bad things. I just wonder whether we can't turn this around and look at Bernard Collaery, witness K, witness J, and start asking ourselves larger questions about what happened to our country, that we ever allowed this to occur. Let's make sure it never happens again. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Geoffrey, for sharing with us your very wide-ranging insights. And the sour note that you finished on is one that we should all be, of course, deeply disturbed by. But I hope that, like you, we might be able to turn this around. And in the spirit of that, we have received a number of questions from participants, and I'd like to ask you both perhaps to respond to them. Somebody has asked, what do we need to do to make the FOI Act effective? And Geoffrey, you said that the rules are routinely broken and ignored. So do either of you have any thoughts on what we might be able to do to fix it?
I've got a simple answer: elect better politicians.
Okay, yeah, and you undeniably are an excellent, simple answer. What about you, Paul? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, look, I think there are some pretty significant structural problems with the FOI Act now, and some of these have been ventilated in really interesting and weird ways in the Administrative Appeals Tribunal. You know, there's some really excellent senior members and deputy presidents there who have kind of explored some of the very strange quirks of an act that is, now 40 years old, that while it did have a sort of revamp a decade ago, there's a lot there's a lot to be desired about it. There's some very unusual outcomes, certainly this issue around ministers, the sort of documents, this sort of vanishing act around ministerial documents when ministers depart an office is one issue. There's a whole range of other problems associated with what happens to FOI requests that are out of time, and better ways that those could be dealt with. One thing that certainly could be worth considering is that in Australia, there is one jurisdiction where, and that's New South Wales, where there are actually criminal sanctions for public servants who interfere with the administration of what's their version of the FOI Act, which is the Gipper Act. I would certainly say that there is potentially a strong case to argue for similar provisions in the federal FOI Act, because it is a really important part of public administration and public trust. And unless you have an enforceable mechanism where there are consequences for failing to comply with the letter and spirit of that, it's very hard for there to potentially sort of be change. And I'd be interested to see whether there's been any research done on the effectiveness of those provisions in New South Wales, whether or how they've been used or deployed, and how that could sort of operate. But I think as well, really there is quite a substantial, quite a pressing need, I think, for a really substantive overhaul of the whole Act itself, and a regulator that is much better equipped to deal with these matters.
All right, they're really useful comments. Thank you, Paul. I think what you say, particularly around the potential in New South Wales for enforceability, it's an interesting point, because if you want to incentivise good behaviour, perhaps enforceability is essential. Related to your comments about New South Wales, I wonder whether either of you, someone has asked whether a question about different jurisdictions' FOI Acts, and I wonder if either of you have experience with other jurisdictions besides the federal and New South Wales Acts, and whether you see that any of those other jurisdictions have particularly valuable different approaches that should be considered for the FOI Federal Act.
I've had experience with both, and I've always thought that the New South Wales system was working really well. But I've been told, strangely enough, only the last couple of weeks, that the New South Wales system is breaking down in a manner very, very similar to the way in which the federal system is broken down. If I can just go back and just say this, I agree with Paul that this system, this FOI system federally, is so broken that it seems as though the only way to get it back would be with some sort of sanction. And I just don't see it happening, but probably the similarities, the similar system in New South Wales, where there can be a criminal punishment in an extreme circumstances, maybe that's the best way to go. But I've heard that the New South Wales system is also breaking down.
And someone else has made a point that's related to these enforcement mechanisms about whether they could apply to public servants responding to Senate estimates. What would you think about extending the applicability of enforcement mechanisms to public servants responding in the context of hearings like that?
I think those, look, the Senate estimates, they're fantastic. They're really actually, just for a brief while, we get to see democracy in action. I think that'd be a great idea.
Okay. All right. Excellent. Thank you both very, very much for the benefit of your experience and your time that you've shared with us today. I'm just going to ask for any last questions to come in before we finish up. Look, it's on a different topic, but it's also very, very topical at the moment. And so I'm going to put it to you if you would like to respond. And that is, someone has asked what the recent vote in South Australia means for the limiting of the state ICAC. Would either of you like to respond on that?
Well, this is actually quite a pretty horrible development. I'm sorry, I'm going to rave on for a little while, so there might be some people who want to get in a comfortable seat. These sorts of integrity commissions only arise really in two ways, or historically they did. They arise because there's been a cathartic event of corruption in a place. WA Inc., the Fitzgerald Royal Commission. They also arise where one government has been in power for a long time and that there has been some sort of odour of corruption around it. And what happens is that a new government comes in and says, rightio, we're going to investigate what they were up to. That's New South Wales. South Australia invented their own new reason. What happened was in South Australia is that there'd been the old stale Labor government there for a long time, and there had been more than one or two corruption issues arise. This is quite brilliant when you think about it. The opposition had said, well, at the next election, we're going to get elected and we're going to bring in an ICAC. And everybody thought the coalition would be elected. So the Labor Party, terrified, did something wonderful. They introduced a half-assed ICAC, an underpowered, hopeless arrangement. And I think they brought it in with the idea that it made them look like they were doing something. And then the new government, they probably wouldn't be inclined to give it more power. Well, Labor did something more extraordinary. They got re-elected. So they had that weak ICAC. By the way, the person running it, Bruce Lander, he was wonderful. He was doing a great job. He just wasn't given the right tools. The thing is that then the coalition got in and they, as predicted, didn't really see any imperative to increase its powers. There's a reason why I'm raving on with this story, so hang on. So over the last couple of days, we've discovered that South Australia is really going to rip all of the teeth out of ICAC. And what a tremendous surprise. That's got unanimous support in the Parliament. Labor, coalition, let's get rid of this thing. Nobody wants it. No politician wants it looking over their shoulder. What a terrible, terrible development. Now, I've been raving on for a while, but just excuse me. I do want to draw a parallel here. I know that I've mentioned him a few times already, but you might recall that Mr. Porter at one stage introduced a bill proposing a federal ICAC. It was weak. You know what it was? It was the South Australian option. They were introducing something which was so weak that it would be just hopeless. For example, it had no retrospective powers. And then they hoped that they could introduce that and that Labor wouldn't change it if Labor had assumed power. I found it unbelievable that I was going around to the politicians to whom I could speak, urging them not to pass Mr. Porter's bill because I thought it was worse than not having one at all. Okay, I'm going to call vindication as a result of the South Australian experience. Sorry for that long rave. If you wake up now, Paul will probably have something good to say.
I'm not sure I did. No, yeah. Look, I have to say I'm not super across the issues around the South Australian ICAC changes. So I don't think I'd be able to add very much to what Geoffrey has said. But I thought maybe I'd just make one final point, and it kind of ties back to some comments that Geoffrey made about Operation Sovereign Borders, and when we were trying to get information about asylum seeker turnback operations using the Foi Act. And as Geoffrey pointed out, we tried to use the Act to get access to ship logs and other information relating to those turnback operations, given the very substantial public interest in them. And we were partly successful at the Information Commissioner's office in one of John Macmillan's last decisions as Information Commissioner. He ruled that we should get access to some of the documents we were seeking. And then it was actually the government that appealed that decision to the Administrative Appeals Tribunal. And it sort of took us 3 or 4 years with the assistance of some excellent lawyers. And I think one of my lawyers, so shout out to Stephen for your help on that. It took us sort of years, and we ended up getting some pretty substantial documents about those operations. But it took years, and of course, in the meantime, what had ended up happening is that whistleblowers instead came to me and revealed some really substantial information about the location of one of the vessels that was involved in those turnback operations, how close it went into Indonesian waters, and it cast some pretty serious concerns over the findings of a government review at that time. And it really was, in the end, whistleblowers and leaked information where we were able to get far more information than we did, and in a far more timely way than under the Foi Act. And I think that does illustrate some of the real strains that the system is under. And I just thought was worth noting as well that in a system that has this mechanism, if people are resorting to ventilating matters of public interest by taking the very serious risk of becoming a whistleblower, that does pose some real challenges, I think.
That's a really interesting comment, Paul. Thank you for that. Now, I will ask one last question before we finish up for today. And I have to say that it is a question that invites broad responses and also potential rants, Geoffrey. So someone has asked for any tips at a grassroots level on how we can elect better politicians.
I regard our system, I'll call it a two-party system, as a cartel. One day I'm going to write something about this. The two-party system cartel. Unfortunately, the way the political parties operate is that the operative wing of the party and the parliamentary wing of the party, by the end of it, will just squash the goodness that's in an individual. I'm not scared of having people who are from minor parties or independents. I know this is going to sound odd. Two incredibly diligent guys who worked in the Senate, who listened to what was being offered and tried to make the best decision. Ricky Muir and Glenn Lazarus. They'd been ridiculed when they were voted in. They worked earnestly to try and get right results. And by the way, both of those men showed more integrity than nearly all of our politicians when they voted against legislation, knowing it would wind up in a double dissolution on the loss of their seats. I'm not scared of people with minor parties. I'm no fan of Pauline Hanson, but if that's the price that you've got to pay, in a system which can also get a Rex Patrick, I'm willing to pay it. And the thing is that I look around and I think of the best people in Parliament at the moment. My two favourites, Helen Haynes and Andrew Wilkie. That's because they are free to make good decisions, free of a party political system, free of the parliamentary caucus room pressures, free of the operational wing of the party. That's a terrible thing in the coalition and Labor. I think that perhaps if we got more independence, we might find that the parties recognise their need for reform. Sorry, that was an opportunity you said to rave.
Well, it's a very informative raving that you've engaged in, so I'm sure that the audience has enjoyed it. Now, I would like to invite you to make any final comments, Paul and Geoffrey, before we finish up for today.
I do. While we've been sitting here, Catherine Maxwell, I'm not sure whether she's still online, sent me an email saying, oh, I haven't caught up with you for a while. You will hold on. It would be a fair while, Catherine, if you're still listening. It must be, I reckon, 1985. But yes, I will give you a call and we'll have a cup of tea as soon as we reopen. Well, look, can I just say to everybody else, I've got two boys. They told me, just give up. I'm not going to give up. I'm asking anybody who went to the trouble of listening to this webinar, don't give up. This country, we can still drag it out of this mess.
Well, thank you, Geoffrey, for enabling us to finish on a positive note, because it was feeling a little bit desolate for a moment there. So thank you for that. Now, again, thank you to both of you, Paul and Geoffrey, for your time today, as well as to all of you who have joined us for this webinar. You can see more about the Centre's work at our website. And if you're interested in receiving information about our research, as well as invitations to future events, please make sure that you sign up to our mailing list also. Okay, thank you again.